Okay, so we're going to continue to look at some Buddhist art today and focusing on images of power and also kind of how some of the art and architecture is influenced by the Silk Road. So on Tuesday, right? On Tuesday, I showed these really briefly, but I just want to remind you that we've mostly seen seated Buddhas, and these are kind of the telltale signs. One of the things I forgot to mention is that sometimes he has either the third eye or a dot in the middle of his forehead that represents his special knowledge. Also, sometimes he has these rolls of fat on his neck, which is kind of interesting. And those are supposed to show strength, that his teachings are compared to a lion's roar. So I'm not quite sure how fleshy rolls equates to the mane of a lion, but I guess it does. And then keep in mind that mudras are those hand positions, and they all mean something different. So they communicate different concepts to you. So we have our seated, and the style changes based on region. Sometimes in early pieces, like at Sanchi, he's not even there. It's just a representation of his feet. Sometimes it's standing, and we'll see some standing today. And then sometimes he's sleeping, or we see him lounging. So that's normally the nirvana where he's moved on to the afterlife, right? So our first image for today is Bamiyan Buddhas, which is 182. And so you have two images, not three, two images for this one. Okay, so let's look at the location of Bamiyan. Is there anything special, and maybe thinking about our target for today, is there anything special about its location? If you know, go ahead and write it in the chat for me, or you can even turn on your audio for me. Thinking about our theme for today, objects and architecture along the Silk Road, right? Along the Silk Road. And the reason that this is important is it channeled a lot of money, right? A lot of money through this region. So remember that the Silk Road was that transportation routes of commerce and goods back and forth between Asia and Europe. So here you can see that this complex is in a cliffside. So it's like rock-cut temples and rock-cut temples in the hillside, and it's along this really lush, fertile plateau. It's not really a plateau, but this green, lush land. So it had a lot of natural resources as well, and so it was a very nice, prosperous, fertile area. So for some reason, they don't give us a single image of this kind of back. They give us two small images. And so I honestly don't think AP is ever going to say which is which, one on the left, the one on the right. But I have it here just in case. So the Varachano, which is the transcendent Buddha, is the one that's on the west or the left side. Okay, and then the one on the east or the right side is the Shakyamuni, which is the image of Buddha as a prince. So that is Siddhartha Gautama, right? So that's him as his kind of princely self. So when you look at the style of the Buddhas, right? Their hairstyle and their drapery are rooted in Gandharan Buddhism. So style that's coming from India, right? And if you remember, we already talked about how because Alexander moved all the way, right? He moved all the way into this region, we could see some stylistic similarities. What are some similarities that you see with Greek art? Maybe turn on your audio for this one. How is it similar to Greek art?
It has what drapery?
Right. So notice how it's got the wrinkles and the creases of the fabric, but it also clings to the body. So both of these pieces are done in that style. So we can see the legs protruding from the fabric. We can see the arms. We can see the abdomen coming through. And so I did a comparison with our Stele of Hegos. So, excuse me. Because she had that wet, clingy fabric where you could see her knee and her thigh kind of pressing through the fabric. So we can see the influence from the West on something that's made in the East, right? So all of that knowledge being transported through this Silk Road, and of course, you know, Alexander coming even earlier, right? So one of the things that's kind of interesting is how these massive Buddhas are constructed. And so here is a plan of it. From the plan, can you tell how you might interact with this Buddhist sculpture? Maybe keeping in mind other Buddhist temples or Buddhist monuments that we looked at. So what do we do at Lakshmana? What do we do at Angkor Wat? What do we do at Borobudur? What do we do? Like, we go there, and do we just go inside and sit and pray? What do we do? How are we active? Who can help me? You can throw it in the chat. You can turn on your audio. Okay, so there is these little chapels that you can walk into. We'll see the other chapels in the cliff sides as well. And if you notice that the feet of the Buddha is not against the wall, so you actually can walk behind the feet. So you can circumambulate, you can go around and around and around as you meditate and chant and pray and meditate on, you know, on what's going on with you, right? And so you can go into these different chapels, you can circle around these colossal Buddha images. So in these niches, and you can see here, there's all of these small little windows that seem to be cut into the cliffside. There was a lot of monks and priests, but also pilgrims. Pilgrims would make, you know, and traders, right, would make their way along the Silk Road, and people would stay in the hillside. People would go and pray and meditate in these small chapels. And so there's a lot of them, and that really talks about how popular of a location this really was. And the inside of these little chapels were painted. And so this is a really bad image, right? Because it's not really left very well, partly because of where this is located in the world. But you can see that it has images. So here we can see red robes, we can see a head, we can see a top knot. And most of these images were painted to kind of represent the history and the story and, you know, the basic teachings of Buddhism, right? So the way that we see them today, just like when we look at something that's Greek or Roman, is quite different than how they would have experienced them. Do you have any idea, besides stone, what these were made out of? Does anyone know? Right? This is a recreation, and we'll talk about it in just a little bit. This is a recreation of what we think that they looked like. So they were covered probably in gold and some jewels on the outside of them. So remember, all these wealth that was coming along the Silk Road, those pilgrims would bring money and they would pay for that decoration on top of that surface, right? So I'm going to stop the recording for just a second here. Sorry, I moved my recording here. The light, right? So they are no longer there. Sorry, there's something up with my projection here for a second. Okay, so we're going to keep moving along the Silk Road. And this one is in your textbook. This is in China, but I just wanted to make sure that you understood that a lot of these large, colossal, mega Buddhist sanctuaries, Buddhist sculptures are pretty common. This one is in Yuyang. This is not the Longmen that we have in our 250, but you can see that a lot of them are cut into the cliff side in order to make them this large, right? So we're gonna look, we're basically in Eastern China, or kind of like almost Eastern China, and we're once again at the merging of major rivers, right? And we're going to be looking at the Longmen Caves. These actually were constructed over time, but the images that they've included in the 250 are from the Tang Dynasty. So we're going to date them as the Tang. And they are pretty much made out of the limestone cliff side, right? So in China, Buddhism moved from India. And if you want some more background on that, there's a video here you can watch. It's from another art history teacher, Mary McDonald, where you can get some basic information on it. And so these Longmen Caves are alongside the Yi River, which would have been a great way to move, people and commerce along that route. And so it allowed for this grand sort of area to be built up. And there are, in this complex, like 2,000 of these caves that are carved into the walls, just like Bamiyan, right? So here you actually get a chance to see what some of those small little chapels look like. And besides the chapels, there's hundreds of thousands, look at that, 110,000 Buddhist stone sculptures, right? There are 60 stupas. So remember that stupas are just these little mounds, right? These little mounds that contain relics, so possibly bones of Buddha or other Buddhist teachers. And then there are almost 3,000 different inscriptions carved on stele, so those monuments. So they have, like I said, a lot of examples. And if you look inside this larger chapel, you can see there is this little, actually it's not little, but it's little compared to the other one from the Tang Dynasty. There's this image of Buddha. And this is from the Wei Dynasty. So this is a little bit earlier. And this was the first group that started to build in this area. And I love this little Buddha because look at his face, right? Doesn't he seem just so joyous and so happy? And like he's got a halo and the light's kind of radiating from him. One of the things that the Chinese emperor and the emperor's family often did is that they would show themselves in the religious imagery. So supposedly this Buddha here looks like the emperor's father, right? And so once again, a part of our theme is images of power, and you can see how they represent themselves in these powerful positions, right? So they typically were painted. So we can see little remnants of color here and there. They were painted in deep blue, red, ochre, and gold. And then often murals were painted behind them. So we have other depictions of the life of Buddha. We would also have important images of bodhisattvas and so on. And so around these Buddha images, there's often bodhisattvas or followers of Buddha carved in sculpture and relief. So the one that is in the 250, we have two close-ups of Longmen Caves, come from the Tang Dynasty. And this style is heavily influenced by the Silk Road. So we can see the style from India moving through China, and then of course, even farther eventually, we'll go all the way over to Japan and Korea. But in this niche that we have, there are 9 monumental figures of Buddha and Buddha's followers, as well as protectors of Buddha. And once again, we have to think about who are the patrons. Who are you going to write in the patron section of your note takers? Who can just turn on their audio and answer that really fast? Who are the patrons during the way? Who are going to be the patrons during the tang? No one? No one? Right? It's going to be the emperor. It's going to be the imperial family, right? And so these faces, right, of the Buddha represent the royal family. So we have those. So in the very center, we have the Buddha, who is larger, right, than everyone else to kind of show his importance. And then we have smaller officials on the sides. And what I wanted you to kind of pay attention to, and I'm going to ask everyone to do it in the chat, is what are the biggest differences that you see in the style between the Wei and the Tang? So in the chat, how is the styles different of the way Buddha is portrayed here? So we've got different facial expressions. How would you characterize the expression of the one, we saw the smiley guy, right? The smiley grandpa on the left. How would you characterize the Tang one? Got a lot of participants. Isn't he like kind of, I would say calm in a way, but also like with those eyes, kind of just the way that it also kind of feels determined, right? Oop. So these were sponsored by the Emperor Gaozong and his wife, and I believe that this Buddha is supposed to resemble actually her. Now, one of the things that we have at Longmen is we have other images besides Buddha. And so we have lots of smaller images of Buddha, Buddha's followers, but there's also these large colossal figures that aren't like, they're definitely not bodhisattvas. I do not know why, but once again, AP picks a very strange image. So let me show you what it really looks like, right? There's two of these, and this is really typical of Buddhist temples. Will have these two protector images, right? These are Varapanis. And how do they represent, or how do they convey power, right? Let's look at their bodies and their expressions. How do they communicate their function as power imagery and protector imagery? Why don't you turn on your audio this time? You can help me out. Do I have to go back to calling on people? I don't want to. Oh, I guess I have to. Okay, Emily, what do you think?
The pose that he's holding, and also like how his face and like shoulders are like a lot like bigger and like more broad.
Right. He's got the one that you guys have in your image set had big, broad shoulders, and his pose is really active. So I'd even be a little bit more descriptive about that. So like before we were like, oh, their faces are different. Well, how are they different? We want to really focus on that visual evidence. And so he's got broad shoulders. He's got an active stance. Look at his face. He's like snarling, right? He's like mean looking. And look at his six pack. Like you can see the muscle definition in his abdomen, in his biceps, in his legs, right? And then when we look at the other one, he's not as fierce looking, but like the Shiva that we saw, notice how he is stepping on that dwarf image that's supposed to represent ignorance. And so we have these a lot where we have these dueling sort of power images. We'll see this again in Japan when we go to Nara. And so we'll be able to see the style differences between something that's Chinese and something that's Japanese. So you can see how at Longmen, the style depends on the functionality of the imagery. So in the grottos, you can see here that some of the imagery is a little bit easier to see. In Afghanistan, where at Bamiyan things were blown up, but also there's been constant warfare there. The interiors of those aren't as great. Here you can actually see how brightly colored they would have been with the paint as well. Okay, so that, oh, I did it again. Let me go ahead back to my agenda here. Pull up the next. If you need to take a quick stretch, go for it as I'm doing this. We'll pull up the next section. We'll go to China. Okay, so we're going to be looking at Chinese painting and how man relates to the natural world. And then we'll also wrap up today. We'll look at Chinese power imagery. Sorry. Take a stretch, drink some coffee, some tea. Okay, so we're going to take a little bit of time to look at some Chinese painting today. And so we're going to look at the time in which it was made. So thinking about, this is made in 1000 CE, what was going on in China when this was made? Okay, so this was done during the 5 dynasties period of the 10th century. And this kind of falls in between the fall of that Tang dynasty, which we just saw, right? Which we know was like mega powerful, a great patron to the arts. We'll see it again at the Forbidden City. And then the founding of the Song dynasty. There was these small little dynasties kind of like in between of them. And they were kind of like spread around the vast territories of China. So during this time, a lot of intellectuals had to flee. So, intellectuals think a little bit differently than people in power often. And so people like Fan Quan, who's the artist painter that we have here, became a recluse. So what's a recluse, right? A recluse is somebody who basically has left, right, the world, kind of like all of us now, right? Maybe a hermit who lives in their house now, right? Lives in their house and focuses on themselves and often their religion or whatever their practice is. And of course, Fan Quan, like others, were poets and painters. So he really went to the mountains and he focused on his painting and he was trying to seek a spiritual enlightenment, right? So kind of once again, it relates to his religious practice. So he was probably the most famous painter of this like Song dynasty. So like, this in-between period and then later the Song, right? So we already sort of went over this. Okay, so a lot of the imagery is influenced by some different religions that existed in China before and after Buddhism. So one of them is Taoism, right? And so some of those basic concepts. Now, just to save some time, I'm going to kind of go through this, right, with you guys. So we want to think about how his work reflects Taoism, right? So Taoism translates to the way or the path, right? So there's a big integration in your personal journey and you communing with nature, right? So when we look at this painting, right? Look at this painting. What's the visual evidence that relates to this idea of the path and the natural world? I'm going to point out one thing. There is an actual path at the very base, right? So there's actually people on this path, and I'll show you a close-up of it. So there is a physical, actual path, right? Then, right, the rest of the image is all nature, isn't it? Okay, almost all nature, because I'll show you a little bit of human activity in it as well. So we have this colossal mountain, we have this kind of gnarly forest, and we have this path that people walk on, right? There also is some Neo-Confucian elements to it as well. So Neo-Confucianism is a little bit different than Buddhism or Taoism. And so basically this is the idea that you should be rational. It's kind of like the Greeks. You have to be really rational, right? With your philosophy and your mindset. And a lot of this belief comes from actually the kind of like, I want to say the political side, but it's like, let's follow the rules. And so in Chinese painting, there's often these rules that have to be followed. So there's a certain layout or order in which one wants to follow, right? Sometimes there's also things that are hierarchical, right? So things that are large are seen as powerful, and then things that are small are seen as insignificant. And so, of course, the power could be like the elite class, or it could also be something in nature, because can we control nature? Can we control a typhoon? Can we control a hurricane? Can we control a tornado? We cannot control nature. It is very, very powerful. And so man is really small in comparison. So we often see depictions of people as really, really tiny in Chinese painting. So the Neo-Confucianism is, right, coming from China, but it also was influenced by Buddhism coming from India along Silk Road and so on. And so in this, we often have a lot of this kind of concept of opposites, right? Big, small, yin, yang, male, female components to a lot of imagery. And so, and it all relates to kind of the natural order of things. So if you were going to look at this painting, what would you say is maybe a yin quality? A yin is maybe a female quality, or what is a masculine quality? So let's just start with the yin first. What is a yin quality here? And in the very bottom, I put the definition of yin and yang based on Smart History. So yin is feminine, dark, receptive, yielding, negative, and weak. I hate that, but that's okay. I'll let that go. Because we all know us feminines, right, are not dark and negative. Any ideas? Does anyone know what this stuff is right here in the middle? Does anyone know what that stuff is?
Like mist?
It is mist. And actually the Chinese name for landscape is mountains and water. And so the water in this one is not a river, it's not an ocean, it's not a lake, it's the mist. And so in the fog, can we see? No, right? So this, right, this the mist is part of that yin, right? It's dark, you can't, like, it's light, but you can't see through it, right? And then the forest is a little wicked. We'll see some close-ups of it. The trees are very angular, it's very dense, and so on. And then the yang, right? What is the masculine or assertive or strong features of this piece? What do you think? Probably the best example is that big giant mountain, right? Right? So this painting also has some just organization and order as well. And so here's some really big philosophical pieces of it as well, which I don't think I even quite understand, the lie and the key. However, it is all about patterns of reality and vital life force, which we've been talking about already. So I'm not going to get too deep into this. Right? Compositionally, the image is broken up as well. So if you pay close attention to it, landscape painters also follow some rules and some senses of balance. And so Fan Quan was using that landscape painting, which I talked about means mountain and water. And so you can see that the top third is the mountain. Then about another like quarter of it is like the mountain hillside, and then the very small little bottom, like a little quarter or less, a little eighth of it at the very bottom is that rocky hillside. So this would have been seen vertically. And so here in this example, you can see the travelers. So they're really tiny. Can you see them right here? There's a series of horses and people moving along. So that shows how small and insignificant. It's like we're little ants, right, traveling along. And then there is a temple actually built right here in the hillside. So once again, power is so dominant, or see, not power, nature is so dominant that we cannot see, right, the human trace, right? The people are so small and nature is so big and powerful. Right? So here's some other examples of Chinese painting. We only really, well, we have more than one, but we have like two, very radical in style. But I want to show you some other examples from different regions. So this one's early spring. Probably, if you've ever gotten a chance to go to a museum, you'll notice that a lot of Chinese painting is done in a scroll fashion. And we'll see a scroll painting from Japan in the 250. So basically what happens is these are made of silk or other paper, and they're unrolled. So what you would basically do is unroll a little section at a time, and it's kind of like poetry. You're supposed to enjoy one section at a time, and you roll and unroll a little bit as you move. And so your vantage point is like not the same when you look at a Chinese scroll painting. But once again, mountain and water. This one actually has physical water besides the mist as well. And then I wanted to show you some stylistic differences between the North and the South. And of course, stylistic differences could be based on artist as well. So you can see that in the Northern song, the mark making is very intentional. It's very dark. It might be a little bit more broad. And then some of the works from the South are a little bit softer and lighter and have a much more delicate touch to them. Okay, so we're going to move to power imagery. Hopefully we'll be able to finish up this today. So we're going to be looking at some pottery from China. And with pottery, once again, we're kind of looking along the Silk Road, right? So I forgot to mention that, right? So our theme is power imagery, but we've got some Silk Road imagery here as well. Now, this is from the Ming Dynasty, right? And this is from a similar time, and it's from the Ottoman Empire, right? How is Chinese painting influenced by things like Islamic metalwork? Is there any similarities that you see? You can just turn on your audio really fast. What do you think?
They both have like geometric patterns.
Right. So they have patterning all over them. And actually, I mean, it's kind of like based on geometry because how like it's organized. It's kind of like a tessellation where it has this interlocking pattern. But we see the arabesque again. Can you see the floral motif from something Islamic? And then you see that floral motif in something that's Chinese, right? Even the shapes, right, are very similar. And so also wanting to kind of just, you know, put this in your head too, is you will notice that Chinese pottery was imitated all around the world. Probably most famously the Dutch. The Dutch, when they were colonizing Africa and all other, and they were like major like you know, power in the seas, they were importing Chinese pottery and then they were emulating it. And so this popular blue cobalt pottery made of porcelain was making its way to Europe, but not being imported, it was being imitated. So the Dutch did it, the English did it, and pretty much all cultures in Europe did as well. Right? So we're going to be looking at the David vases. David is the name of the, I think, the English admiral who eventually got these. And so we are going to watch this video. And when we're watching the video, we're going to be looking at the function of these objects, when were they made and for what ruler. We'll focus on porcelain a little bit, and then how it's decorated. I'm pretty sure I can record Smart History and I don't get my hand slapped. If not, I'll edit it out later. Actually, maybe I'll just do it. I'll pause recording. There we go. So remember from the video that these are altar vases. You guys hear me okay? Because I switched my audio? Okay. And that they were commissioned by Zheng Wenjin. So we actually know the patron of these, and he had them made for a Taoist temple that was dedicated to a general who becomes a god in the afterlife. So porcelain is a very, very high-end pottery. We've talked a lot about terracotta in this class or earthenware, and porcelain is very, very smooth. It's actually really difficult to work for or work with. It's hard for ceramicists to throw on the wheel. It's also hard to build with because it's so smooth. It structurally is, it's kind of soft, to tell you the truth. And so it was first used for the imperial court, and then it becomes part of the import culture or the export culture. And like the video said, blue actually isn't native to China. It actually comes from Iran. So once again, being transported along the Silk Road. So knowing that it was made, it has an inscription on it that dates it to 1351. So we know exactly when it was made. And it's one of the oldest examples of blue and white pottery that we have. And then keep in mind, once again, that this is from the Yuan dynasty, which is the Mongols. They operated a large territory. So the inscription, right, tells us who this was made for and when it was made, and that is along this top section here. And then how is it decorated? What is incorporated in the imagery? So what is in that blue? What is the motifs that we see? What is the decoration? What do you think? What do you see?
Looks like a dragon.
Right. The major image on the belly, so like the widest, excuse me, the widest part here is a large dragon. And so we have the great dragon, which is a power image, right? Emphasizing our theme for today. We have characteristics of yin and yang. We have a phoenix. So there's phoenix in the neck. Can you see the birds? Which is that regenerative quality. There's elephants. So can you see how the handles are actually elephants rather than just simple rings? You can see the tusk in the head and the eyes. And then we see things like leaves, vines, flowers, and so on. Right? So we're going to move up to Beijing, and we're going to end today. Oh, actually, let's see, maybe end today. We'll see how far we get. We do have one more image after that. We're going to be at the Forbidden City, right? So the Forbidden City is an imperial palace that was made from the Ming Dynasty all the way to the I'm going to pronounce it wrong. So the Qi Dynasty. I'm sorry, I don't remember how to say that. Does anyone remember? Qing. Anyway. And it's located in Beijing. And it's obviously, well, maybe not obviously, the Forbidden City was the home of the emperors and their households, as well as the center of politics. And so for over 500 years, there was a series of almost 1,000 buildings, all dedicated to homes for the imperial family and all of the sort of civic buildings that they would need to rule and govern. So in 1925, once the emperor in China, when there was no longer an emperor, it became a museum. So today you would go there and be able to see a lot of the collections and the artifacts from the Ming and the dynasty. Right? So you have the plan of the Forbidden City. And so how would you say that this is organized? How would you characterize the organization of the city? Anyone? So we call this the courtyard style. And one of that is because there is a lot of large open spaces for people to fill. And when I say people, I don't mean the everyday common person. I mean the court. So you had to be of a certain status to be able to enter into the gates of the Forbidden City, hence the name Forbidden, right? It's not for everyone. And so it has large sort of courtyards in the front of it. And then that red line that I put there for you shows that it basically is directional, right? It has like one major entrance that you walk through, and then it has symmetry on both the left and the right side of the plan. So when you look at it from this way, you'll notice that there are some like the outside of it for kind of like the common everyday people have these really lush gardens. And then see this blue area? That's a moat. So like at Angkor Wat, it's protected by a large body of water. And then about 2/3 of it is all the kind of the imperial governmental sort of power, the ceremonial area. And then this back part here is the residential area for the royal family, concubines, family, extended family. Right? So here we have an aerial view of it. And so does anyone know what the name of this monumental entrance is? And what effect it's supposed to have? Let's go ahead and look at it close up, right? So this is the Meridian Gate. And so when you look at this image, right, if you're standing on the ground here, what would be your first impression? Go ahead and write it in the chat. I'm just checking to see. We have a few different images from Forbidden City, and I want to check. I forgot to put a star. And I think you have this as one of your images. So in the chat. Slightly different. So the first on 206, the very first image that you guys have is this gate, right? It's intimidating, it's grand. Look how tall those walls are, right? So the Meridian Gate is really like focusing on the power of what takes place on the inside. And you can see that the doorways, you know, they kind of go like halfway up the wall, but they're still enormous, right? So this kind of gives you just an idea of how big and grand this actually is. And so it really funnels people into kind of these small little ways to get in. So once again, I showed this before, the outer court, right? That's where the extended court would be able to participate, and then the inner court they would not be able to go into. So that's really just for the imperial family. And you can see that those buildings back there are much more small. And that's full of little temples and residential areas for them to enjoy, because they never ever left the walls. It was very rare for the imperial families to ever leave the walls of the Forbidden City. So in a way, it was kind of like a prison as well. Occasionally, an emperor might leave to go see territories or whatnot, but most of the time people came to him. Right? So here is the other side of the Meridian Gate, right? So you can see once people kind of come through the opposite side, and once they cross it, they actually have to cross another body of water, and there's these 5 bridges, and the 5 bridges lead you to the gate, excuse me, this other gate, but it has a building above it called the Gate of Supreme Harmony. So it's this colossal structure. And if I go back to here, right, you can see that because this is all, you know, based on central, you'd walk through the Meridian Gate, then you'd walk to this Gate of Harmony, and then you would enter a large space as well. So everything that's important is centered in this plan. Right? So all full of power imagery. So all of these court people, right, they're still socially elite, would have to, you know, create processionals and walk along these bridges. And then we reach the Hall of Supreme Harmony. And this is in your image set. So you have this, right? It's like the third image that you guys have in the note takers. And so what's the function of this building? This is like the third colossal structures that we enter. This is at the very center of the Forbidden City. So what do you think its function must be? Oh, we're falling asleep, right? This is where the throne of the emperor was. So this is where he sat on the golden dragon throne, kind of representing the sun god as well. And this building was a place of, obviously, where the throne was, but other important events took place in this building, such as the weddings. And this is a colossal hypostyle hall. So to be a hypostyle hall, it's held up by colossal columns, and you can actually see some of those columns on the exterior here, kind of in this porch area, right? So it's the largest building, right? And that makes sense, right? This is the seat of power. This is the largest building in the complex. It's located in the exact center of the complex itself. And it has been rebuilt over and over again because of fires. So I think it says here, it's been destroyed 7 times. A lot of these structures were made out of wood, right? So what about this tells us, just physically by looking at this, not knowing that there's a throne inside, what physically tells us that this is important? How does this communicate power? What do you think?
There are like stairs leading up to it, so you have to travel up.
Yep, you have to travel up, and it's on that colossal kind of like podium, or like it's elevated, right? So you have to get up the stairs to get into the building, and then it has that beautiful gold roof that has those really dramatic angles to it, and then it has this really, and almost the whole complex has these beautiful gold, yellow, and red paint on the structures, right? And so it's elevated, it's the largest structure, and it's colored, it's painted in imperial colors of red and gold. So those are the telltale physical signs that this is an important structure. We can't really see it very much, but it has like 3 layers to it. So I think this is the first layer, the second layer, the third layer, and it has incense burners, but I can't see those up close. So notice that it is in the very center. So it's right here, right? It's right here, and it faces south. This is a really important concept. Any idea why this faces south? We looked at Beijing on the map, and it's pretty far north, isn't it? So this is looking at everyone. So the emperor, when he sits in his throne, right, which is behind the central doorway, he can face and see all of his territory. Now, symbolically, right, because he can't see all of it, right? Can't see all of China. But theoretically, and this comes from the Mongols. This style of court comes from the Mongol dynasty. And so the arrangement of this is also supposedly created based on feng shui. So that idea of balance, right? That was a real common, sometimes in interior design, people organize things based on the feeling of kind of balance of wind and water, so that there's influence over good and bad. So here is the large dragon throne. Typically, the imperial dragon has 5 fingers to it. And so anything that's made for the imperial family, when you look at the dragons, dragons can be 3-toed or 4-toed or 5-toed, but the 5 ones are typically for the imperial family. And so the emperor would sit on this gold throne facing the south, and you can see that it too is just elevated. And then his court would do ketao, which is basically they would fall to their knees and bow to him 9 times. And the number 9 is repeated over and over again at the Forbidden City. We'll talk about that in a second. So here's some imperial imagery, these bronze lions. You can see the painting on the facade a little bit clearer here with the blues and the reds and the yellows, right? So here, you get an idea of that use of 9. So in the dragons, notice that there's 5. 5 is halfway between 0 and 9. And so it's like a really important number. So then 9 on the doorways, there's these 9 sort of golden balls on the facades. And so 9 is a spiritual number in Chinese beliefs. And so supposedly, right, it's a little bit off. I think it was 9,080 or something, but 980. But supposedly there's 9,999 rooms at the Forbidden City. And a lot of use of 9 is repeated over and over again in the different structures. So just like we saw in a lot of Christian art, and we'll continue to see in Christian art, the use of 3s, right, to represent the Trinity. In Chinese art, we often have 9 or 5 because it's half of 9. Right? So here's the interior of the hall. You can see it's a hypostyle hall with those colossal tall columns and the flat roof, right? And then we're going to move to the inner court. So the inner court, we move through a colossal gateway, and we move past the Hall of Preserving Harmony, We can see the Palace of Earthly Tranquility, Hall of Celestial and Terrestrial Unions, the Palace of Heavenly Purity. And then we move into some of the private quarters. So like I said, the very back part was really just reserved for the imperial family. And so one of those structures is the Palace of Tranquil Longevity. And that was created by a emperor in 1771, and he was going to use it when he retired. And so that is this detail that we have here on the upper left, right? He never retired, which is the funny part, and he never really used the residence for it because he just stayed in power instead of retiring. So I love the interior of this because look at the bed, right? Look at his bed and like the division of space. It looks like, I shouldn't say it's a bed, but this little space here looks like a mini temple inside the structure. So these gardens, right, or these residential spaces had really small, intimate spaces. It's very different than the very vast public spaces that we see in the outer court, right? So outer court, we'd have thousands of courtiers. In this part, there would just be a few people. So the people who help, take care of the royal family, courtesans, that sort of thing. So the interiors had little tranquil gardens and beautiful spaces. Okay, so I think I had another video. It might be on Canvas for you guys to watch about the Keitao and like what life was like in the court. It feels like when I moved this into Google, that link disappeared. So it would be in the homework assignment. So if you're interested, you can look there at that video. Let me look real fast at the time. Oh, I think we might have time. Let's finish China. So let's look at this other. So this is the second image that we have for Chinese painting. And this is an image of Chairman Mao en route to Anyuan. And so how is he represented? You probably have seen, maybe not thousands, but you've probably seen a lot of images of Chairman Mao. But you probably have, well, maybe you've seen this one. I had never seen this one. I normally saw him as older. How is he represented, right? Think about his pose. What's he wearing? What do you think? What do you think? Did you guys find it in the note takers?
Yeah, it's 212.
212. Yeah, I didn't go far enough. Thank you. Okay. I just want to make sure I included it for you. Right? There we go, Jasmine. So he looks pretty proud, right? He's standing with his kind of chest puffed up and he's like looking towards the future. So he feels very confident and inspiring, right? And so he's dressed in a very simple sort of like, I wouldn't say like a monk costume, but like a very simple sort of costume, a very simple dress, I should say, right? And so what he is doing is, this is one of a series of idolized images of Mao. And so this is depicting when he was younger, when he walked to Anyuan to help assist a strike for workers at a coal mine. And so he was there kind of to mediate and to help with the cause of these people who, these workers, right? These common people who were probably not getting their fair share. And so he was kind of like a mediator and to kind of help with, get the miners what they wanted and needed and deserved. Right? So in Chinese painting, in the 1950s, 60s, and so on, art kind of followed a set of rules. So just like we saw when we looked at Fan Quan, there was a set of rules. And so the official government often used art as propaganda and to kind of illustrate the ideals of society. And so this image was used over and over again. And supposedly there's like 900 million reproductions of it. And it became so famous that people saw it on obviously like the sides of the buildings and billboards and things, but it was also on statues, calendars, kitchenware. Like this would be a common everyday image that people would have in their households in China. And it was, to show his help and aid of the common people. And so during the Cultural Revolution, a lot of artists kind of worked under these rules. And so they kind of tried to follow, they either followed the rules or they were outcast. So a lot of, sort of like what we saw with Fan Quan, a lot of intellectuals either fled or went into hiding or stopped working because of the threat of the Red Guard. And so lots of books and artworks were destroyed during this time. But let's focus on this one, right? So should have stuck this back in the earlier part, right? So this is how this relates to Anyuan March in Chinese history. And so this was he organized a nonviolent strike of 13,000 miners and railroad workers. And he saw the suffering of the miners as symbolic of the suffering of the common sort of poor or working class of China. And a lot of these miners were enlisted into the Red Guard or into the Red Army and became soldiers for communism. So what are the characteristics about this painting that are similar to Fan Quan's? So when we look at this, can you still see any elements that says this is Chinese painting? We're almost done, I swear. Answer. What's similar? What does landscape painting mean?
There's the fog.
Right, so we have the water and the mountains, right? And then there are some more modern sort of components to it. And so it's done in oil paint. So the original was done in oil paint, and then it was mass produced in printed image. And so it has kind of like westernized style of the modeling of light and shadow using oil paint. But you can still see him in the midst of nature. But unlike Fan Quan, where man is small, here, Mao is large, right? He's larger than life. And one of the reasons is it's done in the style of social realism. So social realism is a style that we actually see across the planet. It's a style that's used because it's understandable to the people. So this is art made for the common person, not the artistic elite, right? Not us who love to go to museums and are art snobs, right? This is made for every people. So the idea that it's super realistic appeals to people, right? And everyone can kind of understand the stories. And notice that it is a departure from the traditional ink painting or sumi-e painting that is typical of Chinese art, right? And so Mao encouraged this kind of work. And so he standardized how he should be portrayed. So we often see him centered, right? Centered in the imagery. He's often seen in the sun with all of the followers around him. And we'll see Ai Weiwei's sunflower seeds at the very end of the semester. And we'll notice how the sunflower and the sun is really representative of this time in history, because Mao was the equate to the sun, and the people were the sunflowers changing their direction and facing his greatness. So the sunflower or the people, are always around Mao. right? And then we can see Andy Warhol. This is actually some images of him from the 60s, where he did images of Mao. And this was to represent this idea that when you go to China during this time, you would see images of Mao literally everywhere, big, small, in people's houses and so on. So this is kind of imagery that was repeated over and over again. Okay, so that's all we have for today. If you have any questions,